Riddle me this, players. I got a question for you. Wait a minute. We already did this gag the last time. We'll come up with something new. Let's just keep it a buck. Got a question for y'all. What is the difference between a rapper and a lyricist? Well, I'll keep it really simple because it can be a very nuanced question, but you came to the right place. I'm going to put you on game. A rapper, for the most part, is someone who is an entertainer, using words and music, marrying together to energize a crowd, to move a crowd, if you will, emceeing. However, a lyricist is a level above that. A lyricist is all about the words, painting pictures with the words. I've often seen rap broken down into rhythm and poetry. It's a good way to put it. Lyricism is all about the poetry. It's using the words at a higher level to create bigger, broader stories for your mind's eye to peek into. That's kind of the difference. So when you think of great lyricists, you think of the Roots' Black Thought. You think of Nas, who has shown that lyricism isn't going out of style, even though he's got many, many years in the game. Of course, you think of Kendrick Lamar, in my opinion, the greatest lyricist of his generation. Ain't nobody in that crew of lyricists doing it like him. No question. But perhaps the most overlooked lyricist and maybe the most well-rounded of them all gotta be my boy, Lupe Fiasco. So Lupe, if you're a fan like me, crashed on the scene in the mid-2000s and we just knew. We knew this dude was the guy who was gonna take rap to another level. He was the same energy we had with Nas in 92 and 93 and 94. That's the energy we had with Lupe. He just was so creative, so inventive with his words, painting pictures with every single album. And he still is. I know that there has been some criticism along the way, and we'll get to that a little bit later on. But when it comes to being able to paint a picture with his music at a high level consistently, I don't think anyone can do it as well as Lupe Fiasco. If you don't believe me, that's what we're talking about here today. We are going to rank every one of Lupe's LPs, all 9 of them, ranking them from bottom to top. Join your boy. Let's talk about some lyricism. Welcome players to another edition of the Soul and Stereo Sessions right here on YouTube. I'm back and I'm glad to see y'all are back too. And yes, today we're talking about one of my faves, Lupe Fiasco. In my opinion, one of the greatest lyricists of this current era. Man, if only he had been the heights that we thought he was going to be. We'll get to that later on. Because I know that there's this narrative that Lupe underachieved or didn't do what everyone thought he was going to do. There could be an argument there, but let's not overlook that this man has given us some of the best albums and songs and concept records over the past 20 years. In fact, just recently, we just celebrated 18 years since his landmark debut. We'll be talking about that album very later on. Very later, that's a hint. On this list, and it just was one of those records that just transformed a new fan base of hip-hop. I think it brought in a new fan base, and in some ways it continues his legacy today because people remember those glory days and it pushes him even further. And don't front, he's still putting out great albums even this year. Before we get there though, do your boy a favor, go down, if you haven't already, hit that like button on this video. Show your boy some love with that. And if you haven't, make sure you subscribe to this channel. The large majority of y'all who watch these videos, per my analytics, shows that you're watching the videos, but you aren't subscribers. What part of the game is that? It's free. Just hit the button, hit subscribe, and I'll be very grateful. And when you're done, make sure you share this video with a hip-hop head or Lupe fan in your life. They're going to dig it, I promise. So anyway, let's get to it. Lupe's greatest albums from bottom to top. Most of them are pretty great. Some of them, Let's start out with the Alright, bringing up the rear in this list, coming in at number 9 is Drogas Light. See, y'all thought it was going to be Lasers. You thought it was going to be Lasers. We'll get to that one later. Stop hating on Lasers. We'll get to that later. I think I get where Lupe was going with this album. Remember, this is Lupe. Everything he does is with intention. He doesn't do anything by accident. He doesn't throw a bunch of random songs on an album and just call it an album. No, that's called a playlist. He doesn't do that. Everything he does is intentional. And this album, you remember the song Dumb It Down, one of his best songs, where he talks about how he was encouraged to bring down his lyricism to appeal to a more wider audience? I felt like that was the concept of his album. It's a lot of contemporary production, a lot of taking the styles of the time and him kind of pulling back from the heavy lyricism and doing that. I think he was trying to make a statement about what was going on at the time, or even maybe saying, hey, they're doing that, I can do it better than them using their style. But it just didn't work. There are some great songs here, and there are some points where it does get a little bit more into the philosophical Lupe that we know, but it takes too long to get there. It's a lot of meh here, and that's not something that's typical of a Lupe project. I think this was a misguided attempt at a narrative that didn't quite work, and what we got was a bunch of songs that just underwhelmed. He tried, but not rocking with this one. And here it is, coming in at number 8. Yes, the very infamous album Lasers. I won't go into the details of the story. Most of you watching this video already know. Long story short, Lupe was coming off 2 very, very successful albums. The label wanted him to go in a more mainstream direction to get, and you know how labels do. They want that radio play, they want that video play, they want the club bangers. They asked him to go in this direction. Lupe pushed back, so it was kind of like this weird clash of an album that we got, and it just didn't work. Lupe has denounced this album in some ways, and fans have crapped on it. It's not as bad as people say. It's not a great album, and it's certainly an underwhelming Lupe album, but if it dropped today, it probably might be in my top 50 albums of the year. The problem is it's just, again, so inconsistent and so unlike Lupe. But the songs that really work. I thought there was some really dope tracks here. Unfortunately, it's the between label interference and lack of vision really hurt this one. It's not the disaster that social media will tell you is, not by a long shot, but it is an album that unfortunately was supposed to take him to new heights. It didn't. Coming in at number 7 is Food and Liquor 2, the Great American Rap Album Part 1. Did we ever get Part 2 of this album? I don't think we did. Anyway, this album kind of gets lost in the Lupe conversations because it came after the Lasers fiasco. But it was before his revival, and the album we'll get to very much later on. So it kind of gets lost in the sauce. And at the time, I really liked this album because I thought it was a solid rebound from Lasers, which again wasn't terrible, but it was a misstep. I thought this was more in the line of the previous 2 albums before it. Not as strong, but and subsequent re-listens, especially listening, it doesn't hit me the same way as it did back in 2012. It has its high points for sure, but there are a lot more so-so moments that I had forgotten about. So overall, it's an okay album. It's one that's easily lost in his discography. Gets lost in the sauce pretty easily because there are a few standouts here. Some good dope tracks, but nothing that really sticks with me. Coming in at number 6 is Gus Wave. If you know me, I quite often complain about albums, modern albums, being way too long. And it's not because, oh, I'm too lazy to listen to an album or whatever y'all ran about in the comment section. Hush. That's not about that. The problem is there's so much that there is no narrative. Nothing is said. It's just a bunch of songs that half of them are extraneous. Even though Gus Wave is a very long album, a very dense album, a very heavy album, there is actually a message here. Lupe is talking about the slave trade, and he's talking about water and this inherent fear that a lot of black men and women have of water and surviving that. It's a very intentional and complex concept album that I think works very well. But it does take a little bit of time to wade through it. No pun intended. But it's worth it. So even though it's heavy, even though it's not a recommended listen, if you were trying to find an album, you're like, hey, I want to see what Lupe is about. Let me pick an album. This would not be the album that I picked for you for first. Too heavy. But with a little bit of seasoning, understanding Lupe as a lyricist and understanding his storytelling style, I think there's a lot to love about this album. It goes very, very deep. It's very thought-provoking. And considering the other albums on this list, it's a level up in storytelling. It's very, 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 very heavy. I keep going there because it is. I don't want someone to come back and be like, oh, I couldn't make it through the album. I can understand that because it does take some patience. But it is a very rewarding album if you open yourself up to it. Coming in at number 5 is an album that just came out. Lupe Samurai. So this album is the follow-up of Drill Music in Zion, which we'll get to in just a second. And it kind of takes the style of that album, the jazzy score, the more laid-back, almost lo-fi production, and builds upon that. Lupe is being Lupe all over the place, showing that he is a master lyricist. And when it comes to Samurai, I love that he takes the black samurai culture, was always been kind of this, I don't know, mythical thing in Asian culture, which of course Lupe, as you know, is a big fan of. He is a practicing martial artist, so it's not strange that he would incorporate that into this album. But I love how he bucks the trend on this. He has some incredible songs. It's a very, very solid album. And as a predecessor to, well, as a follow-up to Drill Music in Zion, it's not quite as solid as that album, but it's still very strong on its own. Y'all stay tuned when I do my best albums of 2024 list later this year. I'm pretty sure this is going to be up there somewhere in the mix. Another strong Lupe album. Doesn't reach the heights of his top work, but very good and easily one of the best albums we've seen this year. Alright, in at number 4, as promised, Drill Music in Zion. This was Lupe's return after a few years off. He hadn't given us any LPs. He had been sprinkling a lot of loosies and mixtapes and EPs and things like that during that time. This was the first LP in a minute, and he returned to form. I love this album because of its simplicity. As I mentioned earlier, it's kind of laid back and pulled back into production. It reminds me so much of that early 90s Tribe Called Quest jazzy feel to it. And it's just something that hits me nostalgic because that was kind of the era that I started to form my hip-hop fandom. So it pulls me back into that. But Lupe, of course, has his incredible storytelling. Just incredible storytelling. Building upon that. And this is a pretty short album. Unlike Gus Wave, which is, man, it's so dense it might go over your head. This is very short, very sweet, very focused and intentional. But if you are a fan of lyricism, or if you are a fan of uncovering metaphors and listen to a song over and over and over and over and over again to kind of get the messages that he's saying, almost like a puzzle, this is an album that really works for you for that. This one pairs well with Samurai. It's kind of like a two-piece. Although I think this album's a little bit stronger. Both are very good, and both are well established in his LP's discography. Coming Coming in at number 3 is Tatsuo and Youth, and this album made me so happy to be a Lupe Fiasco fan. In 2015, to be honest, many people hadn't written the man off. After the Lasers mess, we know, I keep going back to that. And then he had Food and Liquor Part 2, which was, I thought, good, but it was kind of overlooked at the time. You just didn't really hear much from him anymore. He kind of just went under the radar. He did have a few good kind of feature verses here and there, but we didn't have an album per se. And this is the one that returns the form. An album almost as good as his incredible sophomore and debut albums. It gets back to the core of what Lupe is. It's all about great storytelling, great lyricism, and we got a lot of the socially charged lyrics that we were missing at the time. You gotta remember 2015 was kind of the burgoying point in our culture where we were starting to see a lot of artists get more socially and politically active about things that were going on in our country, whether it's from the White House or what was going on overseas, or police brutality against black men. So artists were starting to come out of their shell and talk about these things. Lupe was already doing it, and he was trying to drop these nuggets on us well before people were co-opting Kendrick's All Right and things like that. So yes, that was to come, and that was great. But this album really set the tone for what was really happening there. I love this album so much. It's one of mine that I continue to go back to. And of the albums that came out in the 2010s, which has always been kind of a shaky time for hip hop, just to be honest, had his highs, had his lows, but this is one of the best albums of that decade and one of the best of his career. If anybody else had this album, it'd easily be their best, but it's a testament to Lupe that this is only number 3. Coming in at number 2, some of y'all might argue with me with this one, but it's Lupe Fiasco's The Cool. If you get with a hardcore Lupe fan, there's going to be one argument that will always remain. Is it The Cool or is it Food and Liquor? Which album is best? Obviously, you can tell what I picked by the order of this list, but that's no shot at The Cool, which I believe is a very, very, very good album. There's a song on Food and Liquor that basically is called The Cool, and this album kind of expands upon that concept that was in that album. That I thought that original song was incredible. This album just builds upon what we saw before it, but takes all of the storytelling and metaphors and narratives to a greater level as the one opposed to it. And I think that the reason why it resonates so much with some fans is because of what he's talking about here. He's talking about finding solace in music. He's talking about the fame and superstar and how he's accepting this role of fame. He's talking about how he can relate to this world around him. And I think that really resonates with people who listen to it today. Easily one of the best albums of the 2000s. But still not the best Lupe album, not in my opinion. Let's get to number 1. Yes, coming in at number 1, Food and Liquor. There are some albums that drop, and to me, it's almost like a seismic shift in my fandom. I think of Kanye West's College Dropout. I think of Kendrick Lamar's Section 80. I think of albums from artists who came out and they weren't trying to be somebody different. They were being exactly who they were. They weren't being like, oh, everybody's out here pretending to be in the trap house, so I'm going to make a trap house album. No. Lupe was like, I'm this dude who rides skateboards and likes anime, and I also like hip hop, and I know hip hop can be problematic, but I'm going to tell my story as part of it by also talking about some of the problematic areas. I'm just being honest. And that's why this album is so appealing. It is an honest reflection of a man with incredible rap skills, with incredible insight, and actually some really good production as well. An album, in my opinion, that should be up there with Jay-Z's Reasonable Doubt. It should be one of those albums we talk about that just transformed the career, transformed the landscape. while it did become a fan favorite and a critical darling, I don't think it really changed the scope of hip-hop itself like it should have, like I wanted to. As a biased fan, I can say, oh yeah, this is an unmitigated classic that changed the game. That didn't quite happen. But it did change my fandom and had me respect Lupe so much more as a lyricist. And at a time where lyricism was being put on the back burner, I was so happy to see another artist come in who embraced the love of the word. As a writer, listening to these stories and the pictures being painted by his words really resonated with me. Sounds weird, but a lot of my writing actually is influenced by albums like this. So, respect to Lupe, respect to Food and Liquor, one of the best albums of his generation. Yes, it gets 5 out of 5 from your boy. One of the best albums of his era. Can I say it's one of the best rap albums of all time? I think I just might. It's that dope. Respect. Alright, that's it, y'all. Every Lupe Fiasco album to date. What did you think? Do you think Food and Liquor is number 1? Do you think The Cool is number 1? Do you think Tatsuo and Youth is number 1? Let me know. I know you don't think Lasers is number 1, but Lasers is not as bad as y'all say. Go back and listen to it. Promise you it's not that bad. Let me know in the comments what you think, and what's your favorite Lupe album? This edition of the Soul and Stereo Sessions is a wrap. Hopefully, now you know the difference between rap and lyricism, and show our lyricists some more love. They're the ones holding this genre up on their shoulders. Show them some love. Play on, players.